Hello. Hello. Hey everyone, this is Arielle. I think we'll just get started in a few more minutes. Speaking now, wondering if you can hear me. Adam, can you hear me?
guy is crazy. I know. What is happening? So I was thinking it looks like we have a filter on.
A few more minutes.
Cool.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, I looked at the forecast with TR, it's no rain, but 100%. Alicia, look at that rainbow. Okay. Did you get that? You should do that. Yeah. Do that now. We can leave it on Monday now. Wow. Tuesday morning.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining. This is one of the SustainUS COP21 webinars, and I'll be presenting on free trade agreements and climate change. My name is Arielle, and I'm on the COP21 delegation. I think if you have the Google plugin open, if you see there's a square with 9 dots in the top right hand corner, if you click on that, you can open a Q&A panel and you should be able to ask questions through there. Yeah, I think Adam Haas just asked, he wrote a question, why is TPP bad for the climate? Oh, I don't know if you can see that. Okay, never mind. But yeah, you can ask questions through there, and I'll make sure to touch on them if I can. And yeah, so just anytime throughout the presentation, feel free to ask a question through there, and I'll see it. So, okay, also Courtenay Lewis, I've been working with Courtenay Lewis from the Sierra Club Responsible Trade Program for the last few months. Unfortunately, she probably won't be able to join us for a while because her she was testifying for at the EPA, and they shifted her time. So she's doing that right now. So don't think she'll be able to join for a while. But if you have any questions specifically for her, just reach out to me and I'll make sure she gets in touch with you. So the first thing that I kind of want to just make clear is that, so FTAs is going to stand for free trade agreements. And free trade agreements just undermine democracy for the most part, and they the public is not at all, any civil society organization or even Congress members are not really involved in designing the agreements or they're not involved in the negotiations. However, there are corporate advisors that work with the United States Trade Representative to write these agreements, and only the negotiations go on for years, and the text doesn't come out to the public until right before Congress is going to vote on that. So I'll get to that more in the future, but yeah, just undermine democracy. So I'm just going to read this quote. It's a goal for believers in democracy is to ground the bureaucracies governing international trade in democratic principles and accountability as much as possible. The secret privatized bureaucracies hidden within free trade agreements like the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, deploy the power of the state in corporate rather than public interests. They do not facilitate the distribution of goods, but the abrogation of democracy in choosing what is good for all. So free trade, this is a Noam Chomsky quote, it's called free trade, but that's just a joke. And free trade is, these trade agreements don't actually further free trade in meaning the lowering of tariffs, but really just give corporations that are doing business abroad more rights to challenge policy and make sure that they have access to markets in whatever way is going to be beneficial to them. Another Paul Krugman quote, who's an economist who studied this his whole life. This is about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is not a trade agreement. It's about intellectual property and dispute settlement. The big beneficiaries are likely to be pharma companies and firms that want to sue governments. Those are the issues that need to be argued. David Ricardo is irrelevant. Now, David Ricardo was an economist who came up with the term free trade. And even if you, so some economists say that some regulations should be equaled or removed, and that's what enables growth, and that's what's best for the economy. But the determination of what regulations should or shouldn't be left up to corporations to decide, because they don't have the public interest in mind, and that's the idea. And these free trade agreements also lock in the regulatory structure, so they don't allow for democratic alteration in the future. And one more quote about free trade. This is Jeffrey Sachs, who came up with sustainable development and studies that, writes about that a lot. Says their common denominator, meaning free trade agreements, is that they enshrine the power of corporate capital above all other parts of society, including labor and even governments.
Oh, that's a big rainbow.
So I don't, so this is just to show one protest that happened around the TPP when negotiations were happening. And again, there are more than 600 corporate lobbyists that have been giving input on this text for 6 years, which is how long negotiations have been happening. But the public has only been able to see it for less than a month. It came out earlier in November. And now there's some time for the public to look at it, for congressmen and women to look at it and analyze it. And these are some of the U.S. trade representatives' energy advisors. So you're looking at people from Chevron, from natural gas companies, from Halliburton, which is the defense company, but has a lot of interest and investments in natural gas as well. So you can tell that the output and what rights corporations will get in this agreement are determined by these corporate lobbyists, and obviously will be benefiting them. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is one of the agreements that I want to touch on. It's just negotiations just finished in early October, and it is an agreement between 12 Pacific Rim countries that are shown in this map. And it accounts for more than 40% of the global gross domestic product, and negotiations have been going on for a while, as I said, but the text was only made public for the first time earlier this month. And another thing to note about the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that it has a docking station, which means that other countries can join in the future, and that's actually the idea behind this agreement, because the US, which is leading the negotiations, wants to essentially overturn the World Trade Organization, which has been leading negotiations between countries around trade since the end of World War II. Since the early 90s. And the US wants the negotiations under the WTO kind of fell apart for a while, and now the US wants to really lead negotiations under the Trans-Pacific Partnership and get as many countries in the future to join as possible. But for right now, it's these countries shown in the map. It includes Canada, US, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, and then Vietnam and Malaysia, Japan, Brunei, Australia, and New Zealand. The other agreement that I'm going to touch on is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and this is between the US and the EU. And a really big motivation behind the Transatlantic Partnership is that the EU wants access to a lot of energy resources in Canada and the US, specifically tar sands and also shale gas. And lobbyists are trying to use this agreement to attack the EU's fuel quality standards. So I'll talk more about that in a bit. Global Justice Now is an organization that does work in the EU around development and anti-globalization. They say TTIP, which is the agreement I just mentioned between the EU and the US, is a deal that aims to remove non-tariff barriers to trade, which is, again, what the motivation behind free trade is. But there's very little obstacle to trade between the EU and the US at present. Tariffs are at an all-time low. But corporations on both sides of the Atlantic want to remove other rules and regulations that might be stopping them from making even bigger profits. Worse will follow, as TTIP will become the global standard for trade deals in the future. The power shift of corporations will be echoed across the planet. So between TPP and TTIP, the US is really trying to encompass a lot of the global economy in agreements that US corporations, for the most part, will benefit the most from. So another huge characteristic of these agreements are the unrestricted rights that they give to corporations. Both the TPP and TTIP greatly expand the right of corporations to challenge policies that protect people, like food labeling policies, fracking bans, cigarette labeling policies, minimum wage laws, labor regulations, climate policies like renewable requirements. I'll touch on a lot more of that, but it's enshrining corporate rights over the rights of people. And so where these rights are actually determined is in the investment chapter of these agreements. So free trade agreements always have a chapter on investment, and this can be a good thing, but the investment chapters of these agreements encourage investment by giving really broad rights to foreign corporations and investors. And these rights are protected in case new policies or new laws come that reduce the value of their investments and their profits. And so the way that if an investor or a company has ever applied for a permit or a license to do business or to extract oil or anything in a country that's part of the agreement, they then have a right to sue governments over new policies that come that challenge their or reduce a value of that investment or profit, or challenge if it limits their quote unquote expected future profits. And that's what's written in these agreements. So if a law or policy comes that they think would limit their expected future profits, they're allowed to sue the government and often get compensated hundreds of millions of dollars for the profits that they're missing out on. In other words, even if it's just a bad investment, which is how capitalism and this is supposed to work, it's not that you're taking a risk and actually there was a policy that came that made that a bad investment, but you get through this process, companies, investors can actually get compensated for the risky investments and bad investments that they make. And this is all called, this process is called investor-state dispute settlements. And also in the TPP and maybe in TTIP, we'll see when the text comes out, but in TPP, even if these companies can sue governments for what's called indirect expropriation. So even it's not only if a policy comes that it doesn't allow them to extract something, but if a policy comes that reduces the value indirectly of any of their investments. And so this could be yeah, so any like public welfare objectives could, yeah, the USTR even says that, like explicitly, they'll say that public welfare objectives like public health, safety, or environment can constitute this indirect expropriation. So they're even honest about that. And foreign investors, when they want to challenge a policy, they come up with their own demands of how much money they think that they would have lost or that they are challenging for. And there's no cap on the amount that they can ask for. And then most troublesome is the fact that these tribunals are staffed by private sector lawyers who can, in some cases, they are the judges in the tribunals, and then in some cases can actually just represent the corporations. So there's a huge conflict of interest. They're also often on board of directors of multinational companies. And this conflict of interest just enshrines the fact that corporations are really the ones benefiting from this entire process. And you can also see this by the fact that 3/4 of the time the corporation wins and the case is settled with a concession to the corporation. Also, there's no appeal process. So even under the WTO, disputes can be appealed at least once. But under free trade agreements and these investor-state dispute settlements, no, there are no appeals. And then lastly, often these, so yeah, the mere threat of an investor state case has been enough to kind of like dissuade governments from enacting important public interest measures. So even if they think, if a company that had an investment is like mentioning that they will file a suit or something like that, often governments will change their policies because they don't want to have to pay like the exorbitant legal fees that are usually associated with these lawsuits. And yeah, this first bullet, I don't know if I emphasize this, but if a company or investor has ever even applied for a permit or a license, that means that they have some right to sue governments and they have some like interest in the policies of that place. So therefore they're allowed to sue governments. And this could be yeah, even how there's no year limit, so they could have done that in many years before a policy came or anything. If they've ever applied for a permit or license, they can do that. So here are many examples of these investor-state dispute settlements. To date, corporations have launched nearly 600 cases against, I think, 100 governments. And again, it's included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and most likely will be included in the Transatlantic TTIP partnership. And the number of cases would just explode if these agreements are passed. I'll go into a few of these cases more in detail, and also in the PowerPoint, which I'll send out after the webinar, there are many links of where you can look into the details of more of these cases. And right now, actually, there are 20 pending claims under free trade agreements that the U.S. is part of, and totaling the foreign firms are demanding more than $38 billion for different regulations and policies that have challenged their profits. And yeah, I think that's it. So one that I'll talk about a little bit specifically is a case that a U.S. company called Lone Pine Resources filed against the government of Canada for Quebec had wanted to ban fracking. At least it was a moratorium on fracking to look more at the impacts that it was having on water and communities. And Lone Pine Resources sued the government of Canada for $250 million for under NAFTA, which has the same investor-state dispute settlement. And this, I think this case is still going on, but it just shows like the extent to which government companies can go to take back profits. And this is something that obviously a government should have the ability to rethink their policies and listen to people and organizations that are trying to protect the public interest, and should not, then the taxpayer has to pay $250 million for a policy that's really just supposed to protect them. So now I want to touch a little bit on how I think free trade agreements can challenge and really undermine progress that happens internationally to address climate change. First, it's interesting to note that within the Trans-Pacific Partnership text, the words climate change don't exist. There's no matching results. This is from the Washington Post. And that just shows, Obama positions this agreement as a 21st century agreement, and it doesn't even mention climate change or the fact that governments are part of other agreements under the UNFCCC or other multilateral environmental agreements that just have no these two processes seem to be completely separate, and there's no acknowledgement of the agreements that countries sign up to around climate change and the environment. It's just completely separate from trade. And often trade agreements, at least these trade agreements, are positions at a higher level. They're more important for the elite and the corporate class. Another quote from Joe Stiglitz. He says, all the governments in the TPP can be sued for the loss of profits as a result of the regulations that restrict their ability to emit carbon emissions. So Joe Stiglitz has been doing a lot of work on these trade and climate connections, and the thinks that a lot of the environmental and climate policies that could result from the Paris Agreement, at least the ones that are included in countries' contributions, can be directly challenged under the investor-state dispute settlements. One more quote. Naomi Klein says, a series of international agreements, she's talking about free trade agreements, that have attacked working women and men, fueled mindless and carbon-intensive consumption, and prevented governments from enforcing their own laws to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So I, just when thinking about, the contributions that countries are putting forward that are going to be part of the Paris Agreement, there are many aspects of a lot of those contributions that could be challenged under those investor-state dispute settlements within the TransPacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Agreement. And a few policies that could be challenged are the European Union's Fuel Quality Directive, and that was an attempt to limit the carbon intensity of fuels in the fuel that is being used in the European Union. And ExxonMobil has been fighting against this for years and has been successful in weakening it basically. And it tried to do that through the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, and it's trying to use TTIP as a way to weaken that fuel quality directive even further, and an attempt to be able to export Canadian tar sands to the EU. Also, restrictions or bans on fossil fuel extraction or infrastructure can be challenged by any investor or company that, filed for a permit or a license to extract in any region, any state. So even something like Portland's resolution, if that became law, any foreign investor that had applied for a license in the past and wanted to build a pipeline or an export terminal in Portland could sue Portland for their for that expropriation of their profits. So they were expecting profits from whatever infrastructure or business they wanted to do, and they could be compensated for that. So again, a fracking moratorium, which we saw that with Quebec's fracking moratorium, and they've been challenged by a U.S. company under NAFTA. Other renewable portfolio requirements or renewable energy subsidies, again, fuel efficiency schemes, which is part of the U.S. Contribution to the Paris Agreement, and local content requirements, which is a big one. I'll get a little bit more into that. There was a dispute under the World Trade Organization, but so local content requirements or local investment, which is important for when we talk about a just transition, which is trying to replace jobs that are lost due to the end of the fossil fuel era, and trying to replace those jobs with other jobs. It's important to have local investment and investment in the local economy and really prioritize that. But under these free trade agreements, that's they're essentially eliminated. That's not allowed because you're putting extra advantage on the local economy, which is the idea that, yeah, the idea of free trade is opposite to that. And again, when I send out the presentation, there's a Friends of the Earth report on the fuel quality directive that I think makes it really clear. And the U.S. Trade Representative even makes it quite explicit. They had a report that they said that technical barriers to trade, and they highlight a lot of environmental policies that they think are that they would think are barriers to trade and would be able to be challenged. And it's a lot of these similar policies as above. So I just want to go into a few other investor state dispute settlement cases that were involving like climate action. So there was a Swedish energy firm that they launched a $1.5 billion suit against Germany. It was sorry, this is a bad side, but it was a coal power plant that they were trying to increase the efficiency of the coal power plant, and the Swedish company didn't have the technology to really increase their efficiency, and therefore launched a really expensive suit against Germany for trying to give those additional implement those additional environmental requirements. And Germany actually abandoned its standards. It didn't, because it didn't want to pay this expensive suit. A subsidiary of a US-based Renco challenged Peru for $800 million because Peru's mining laws required Renco to clean up pollution. Again, Lone Pine Resources that I mentioned earlier. Another petroleum company, Occidental, challenged Ecuador for $2.3 billion because they terminated an oil contract after Occidental had breached their contract rule. And so a lot of these cases really just show the power dynamic of like multinational companies against a lot of developing countries that don't have money to pay for the lawsuit and are also just extremely dependent on foreign companies doing business. So a lot of the policies that are supposed to protect the people in those countries are thrown out the window if a multinational company thinks that it breaches on their profits. And something also that's intriguing is that TransCanada is right now exploring the option of filing a lawsuit against the US government under NAFTA because of Obama's KXL rejection. So we'll see how that comes about. This is just to show how many new companies will be able to challenge US policies under TPP. It includes a US subsidiary of BHP Billiton, which is one of the world's largest mining companies and doing business in New Mexico, offshore oil drilling, and fracking operations in Texas. And then there are almost 20,000 new companies that can challenge policies in other TPP countries. And those are like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Peabody, and Halliburton. And this is reflecting, again, the US trade representatives, corporate advisors. So something that is quite new to this arena of like trade and climate connections, there's a professor, Gus Van Harten, who is pushing for a provision to be included in the Paris Agreement that would protect any provisions of the Paris Agreement or multilateral agreements on climate change that will be in the future, will protect them from the investor state dispute settlements. And that would be a really remarkable thing. The European Parliament even adopted a resolution last month that implements that recommendation. And Council of Canadians is also really pushing this at COP21. The truth is that it's impossible to include it in the Paris Agreement, at least because it just came too late in terms of drafting the text. But it's still something to note, and something that if you're in spaces, if you're going to Paris and you're in spaces, or you're just talking to people about the Paris Agreement back in the US or anywhere, it's something interesting to note and bring up in conversation, that that's even a possibility, and it shows that what's in the Paris Agreement can be challenged under trade agreements. So it's not only free trade agreements that pose challenges to climate policies and climate action. Also, just under the World Trade Organization, governments can bring up disputes against other governments. So under the WTO, it's not companies being able to sue governments, but you actually need to be a government. So in the past, the US has challenged China's wind power subsidy program. In 2013, the WTO ruled against provisions that were in Ontario's clean energy program that tried to, again, like, promote a just transition and tried to kind of required renewable energy companies to hire people from a certain area and really invest again into the local economy and the local region. And Japan and the EU said that breached trade laws, and those provisions actually had to be overturned, and that made the clean energy program much less successful. A more recent one, in 2015, the WTO just ruled actually against India's solar program. This decision just came out, and India's solar program has provisions that require, again, some of the renewable energy developers to purchase solar cells that were manufactured in India, and that's supposed to support, India's own manufacturing of renewable energy technology, so that they're not relying on foreign companies, and that they can actually increase the productivity of their own manufacturing sector. And the US decided that breached trade laws because essentially they want their solar companies to be able to profit more from the Indian market and don't want India to have its own manufacturing. So when we're talking about developing countries that are trying to, jump the fossil fuel reliance on fossil fuels and instead develop renewable energy, clean energy economies, when they're trying to increase production of renewable energy in their own country, they're being challenged under these trade agreements and also the WTO. So in addition to giving foreign companies and foreign investors rights to challenge clean energy policies and climate policies, there's also provisions within free trade agreements that directly increase fossil fuel production and emissions. And one thing right now that I'm referring to is that under free trade agreements, all natural gas exports will be approved automatically by the Department of Energy. So outside of free trade agreements, if a natural gas company wants to export natural gas, mostly in the form of liquefied natural gas, they have to apply for a permit from the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy has to do an analysis to see whether those exports are in the public interest. But under free trade agreements, exports to any country within that free trade agreement will be automatically approved. And studies show that this will lead to an increase of 20% in natural gas production. And LNG, also liquefied natural gas, is over its life cycle has just as high, or if not more, carbon intensity than coal. Because LNG, you have to cool down the gas and then ship the gas, and that takes a lot of energy. There's also a chance that it through exports. So Japan, as part of the TransPacific Partnership, is the largest importer of natural gas, and studies also show that if there's a lot of demand for exports, then that can lead to an increase in natural gas prices in the U.S. And an increase in natural gas prices in the U.S. could lead to a return to more coal production and consumption. This also obviously depends on a lot of other state regulations and policies around coal and energy efficiency, but theoretically, as prices go up, you could see a return to coal. Also, just because of these free trade agreements, a lot of manufacturing will shift to some of the more developing countries that are part of the agreement, like Vietnam. And the manufacturing and production in a country like Vietnam can be more than 4 times as carbon intensive as production in the US. So that's just a direct increase in carbon emissions. Also, Japan and other countries have tariffs on palm oil imports right now, and those are going to be eliminated under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and lead to an increase in production due to an increase in profitability. So generally, these agreements are corporate welfare, and there are a lot of other benefits that foreign investors and foreign companies get through these agreements. So big pharma is one that's being there's a lot of critique around the rights that big pharma is getting under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because a lot of countries that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership don't have the same patent laws that the US government has, and under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they get those patent laws basically get exported to all countries, and that's going to lead to a lot of generic medicines being taken off shelves and being essentially illegal in those countries, and that's going to lead to an increase in drug prices. The Trans-Pacific Partnership also allows for evergreening of patents, so basically that's referring to little changes in patents or in the production of medicines that can be a new patent can be filed for small changes in drugs, and that essentially leads to patents being valid for a much longer amount of time. Big agriculture is also super supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it basically eliminates any kind of GMO labeling or energy saving labeling. So these kind of labels are eliminated because there's supposedly like a barrier to free trade. And a big one that people, especially like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, are noting is that Wall Street is super supportive because other countries don't have the same allowances of the kind of financial products like derivatives that we allow here in the US, and under the TPP, policies that restrict those kind of products will be eliminated, and big banks will be allowed to sell those kind of financial products in all of the countries. And this could lead to really like a huge destabilization of just the financial sector all across the world, and lead to crises. So I'm not going to go into this too much, but there's some links when I send around the PowerPoint, but internet freedoms are also threatened, and there are a lot of good groups doing good work highlighting the really threatening aspects of TPP that could restrict fair use and eliminate our rights to a user-friendly internet. Also, wages are so low in a lot of these countries, and it's pretty obvious that jobs just shift overseas. So you have almost all labor unions, big labor unions in this country, oppose all these free trade agreements. and are especially opposed to TransPacific Partnership. Also, a major reason why wages are so low in these countries is because workers can't really organize and can't fight for higher wages. They can't really in this country either, but we do have a minimum wage that's higher than those in other countries. Also, these free trade agreements directly challenge like sustainable development in developing countries. It disrupts their local markets. It just increases privatization and increases inequality. So, grassroots movements. Over time, a lot of these agreements have come up, and some agreements we've been able to stop, and some we haven't. And this is just to show you that it's possible, and we did in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we were able to really prolong a lot of these, a lot of agreements, and we can do it again. So civil society all across the world is extremely motivated to shut these agreements down. Really in all TPP countries, there's coalitions and movements that are trying to stop this. These are some of the organizations that are opposed to the TPP in the US. This is really just a selection. There are more than 2,000 organizations that signed a letter against Fast Track, and that's going to be linked in the presentation I'll send around. There was a huge protest a few months ago in the EU. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Berlin against TTIP. These are some of the organizations that do work in the EU around TTIP. And also, I'll be working with some of them to do some events at COP, most likely, that I'll get into in a sec. These are also in the US, in order to try to prevent the Trans-Pacific Partnership from passing through Congress. Basically, the strategy is to try to get Democrats who supported Fast Track a few months ago to be opposed to the TPP. And this is showing especially where those Democrats are. If you think it might be in your district, I linked to a list of these Democrats in the presentation. So really encourage you to look into that and pressure your member to be opposed. And the vote is most likely going to be sometime around March. Could also be if Obama doesn't think that the TPP will pass, he won't submit that legislation. But the earliest it could be submitted, due to the laws around Fast Track, actually make it so that the earliest it could be is March of next year. Also, don't really have time to go into this, but there are like proposals and a lot of other ways in which trade could be more responsible and really benefit the public and benefit civil society and really encourage sustainable development. And countries, especially in South America, are even just trying to back out of these agreements, especially with the EU. So there are going to be 2 COI workshops. That's the Conference of the Youth in Paris, that are around trade and climate connections, and where we're going to be really trying to form a coalition of young people in the EU and the US and other TPP countries to push back against these agreements come in 2016. So on the 27th in the morning, and then on the 28th in the afternoon, if you happen to be in Paris. And there are going to be other events, one with Naomi Klein, most likely, during the second week.
And why are you still here?
I think, yeah, okay, with that, let me check if there, If you have any questions, would love to, if you could submit them now. Otherwise, I think I'll wrap up and yeah, just look forward. So there's this URL links to a form that if you're part of an organization, you can sign on to and be part of the coalition against the TPP in the US. Just looking to see if there are any questions. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. Thank you all for joining, and I hope it was helpful in understanding the impacts of free trade agreements on the climate. And would love, yeah, to just hear if you have any other questions. Feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, thanks so much.
It's really depressing. I should have nice. Like, what's the second to last one? And I'm like, so weak. Like, too real. Like, I have to look later. Have a good dinner. Have a good dinner. Yeah. See you tomorrow. Yay.